If you are anything like me, many of you were probably swept up in the royal wedding fever. Just a couple of weeks ago, the royal wedding celebrations where we had Prince Harry and the beautiful Meghan Markle with such beauty, such pageantry, and at the Windsor Chapel, magnificent. Meghan's dress, a beautifully sculpted Givenchy piece. Prince Harry in a frock coat. That's a new thing I've learned. A frock coat of the uniform of the royals and the blues, and the opulence of flowers outside and inside, and then not just one or two, but 10 flower girls and page boys coming up the rear, helping to carry that 5-metre lace train. Well, John and I were also really enamoured with the robes of the priest who conducted the ceremony, and the American Episcopalian preacher, Reverend Bishop Michael Curry, who brought a stirring message, did he not, on the power of love to the surprised guests. I thought, there was such an aura of dignity, respect, and authority for this priest and this bishop that they carried with them with their regal robes. And so, John and I have been considering changing the church wardrobe. Thank you, Nick Goodrich. And so we just thought that we would share this with you and get your feedback. You can send us emails or texts afterwards about what you think about the new church wardrobe. It's good to have a laugh, isn't it? But seriously, I'm actually going to bring us to a point here. Because what I'd like to do is I would like us to look at the rules and the regulations that surrounded the high priest's robes in the Old Testament. And to do that, we're going to read just a couple of verses from Ezekiel 42, and it's just one of the rules for the high priest's robes. Once the priests enter the holy precincts, they are not to go into the outer court until they leave behind the garments in which they minister, for these are, say it, holy. They are to put on outer clothes before they go near the places that are for the people, to separate the holy from the common. You see, for high priests and Levites alike, holiness, that is, being set apart, was the chief distinguishing characteristic of the priests. And while inner moral purity was essential, God chose to teach this lesson through the required physical perfection of his priests. Do you know that even the colour, the structure, and the design of the priest's robe was a reflection of the temple? You think the priest's robe had the blue and the purple and the gold and the stones? He was like a mini version of a temple. The temple was the place for the presence of God. And you had to go from the outer court through a offering process, sacrificing animals, being washed in the bronze laver, till you get to the inner court, but then nobody was actually allowed in the Holy of Holies. Nobody except the high priest once a year. Anyone, and inside the Holy of Holies, of course, was the golden ark. And if anyone touched that, gone. They would be dead. You see, the distinction between priests and people was clearly maintained so that God's utter holiness would be recognized. And hence, that was just one of the laws, but there was a series of laws for the priests in order for them to maintain their holiness. And so we're just going to look at the qualifications for priestly service, just in case it was something you were considering. So you have to be a male and a descendant of Aaron. You had to be between 30 and 50. You must be unblemished and have no physical defects, so no gammy knees, no crutches, no physical problem. You must not be married to a prostitute, a divorcee, or a widow, unless, of course, the widow was previously married to another priest. Then that was okay. You must marry a virgin. You must have no uncleanness nor disease. So no weeping sores, no leprosy, sorry for poor Graham Morrison. It probably rules you out at the moment. That's sad, isn't it? That's terrible. You must not trim your beard, and you must not shave your head, and you must be dressed correctly in priestly robes, and you must not ever enter the house of a dead person. And you must not ever touch a dead person, with the exception, unless, of course, it was your wife or your parents or your own children. You were allowed to be near it, but even then, the priest was not allowed to touch even his wife's dead body or his parents' dead body or his child's dead body. If he ever did come in contact, even accidentally, with a dead body, even accidentally the close relatives, he had to observe a 7-day cleansing ritual, offer some sacrifices, be sprinkled with some holy water before he was ever allowed to go back to his priestly duties. Well, if I look at that list of qualifications, don't worry, Graham, I'm also out of the list. And only the high priest was permitted to enter into the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle, which had the Ark of God, the presence of God, only once a year, and then we've heard it before, with a rope tied around his ankle. The rope around the ankle was that if he accidentally stumbled and touched the ark and died, nobody else was allowed, because only one person was appointed as high priest for that year. So no one else was allowed to go in and drag out the dead body. So the rope was around his ankle just in case he stumbled, fell, touched the ark, died. They could rip his body out and no one else would have to go in. So that would mean that in today's world, priests would not be allowed to do hospital visits. They wouldn't be allowed to visit the grieving. They could not become sick themselves, nor could they conduct funerals. I'm sort of wondering what's left to do. But it helps us understand the quandary of the priest and the Levite in the parable that Jesus told of the Good Samaritan. Remember the story? The priest and the Levite walked past. You see, there's a whole lot more going on than I am so busy. It was going to be 7 days of cleansing ritual offerings, sprinkling with holy water before they could get back to work. You see, Mosaic law dictated that attached to the hem of the mantle or robe that priests wore were 4 tassels, one in each corner of the garment. And each tassel had a blue thread, one single blue thread through the tassel. The blue thread was a perpetual reminder of the law of God. And they wore that on the hem of their robes. And Pharisees prided themselves in the size of their tassel. The bigger the tassel, the more pure, the more holy that you were. And so they would outdo themselves with the size of their tassels. So I thought I would priest it up a bit today. It's the one thing I own that's got a tassel on it. Wrong colour. Still no good. So, in light of this little history lesson on priests, now we're going to get to today's scripture reading about Jesus, our great high priest. And it's from Luke 8, verse 40 to 56, and the words are up on the screen for you. Now, when Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Are you expecting him? Then a man named Jairus, a ruler of the synagogue, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. And as Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. And a woman who was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up behind him and she touched the edge, and in some versions, the hem of his cloak. And immediately her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus said. And when they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowd, are crowding around you and pressing against you." But Jesus said, "No, someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me. And then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling, and she fell at his feet. And in the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she'd been instantly healed. And then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." And while Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler, and they said, "Your daughter is dead." And he said, "Don't bother the teacher anymore." But hearing this, Jesus said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid. Just believe, she will be healed." And when he arrived at the house of Jairus, he did not let anyone go in with him except Peter, John and James, the child's mother and father. Meanwhile, all the people were wailing and mourning for her. "Stop wailing," Jesus said. "She's not dead, but asleep." And they just laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But he took her by the hand and he said, "My child, get up." And her spirit returned, and at once she stood up. And then Jesus told them to give her something to eat. And her parents were astonished, but he ordered them not to tell anyone what had happened. So, we're now continuing our preaching series on knowing Jesus. And it's hard for us to actually comprehend the radical contrast between the Old Testament high priests and Jesus, our once-for-all final high priest. You see, Pharisees and synagogue leaders of this day were still observing the Old Testament laws and rules. They were going through the sacrificial system, wearing the priestly robes at this time. And here is Jesus. He's recognized as a priest. He is a rabbi. Even as a child, he outdid the teachers in the temple. And he's appearing now to break most of their laws, or should we say, fulfill their Jewish laws. Hebrews 10 verse 11 to 14 says, "Day after day, every priest stands and performs his duties again and again. He offers the same sacrifices which can never take away sins. But when this priest," see, Jesus is called a priest here in Hebrews, "when this priest had offered for all time one sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God, because by one sacrifice he had made perfect forever those who were being made holy." I think we underestimate what a big deal it was for Jairus, a synagogue ruler, to fall at Jesus' feet and beg him to come to his house where his daughter was dying. Jairus knew better than most what he was asking, that he in fact was asking Jesus to defile himself by coming into contact with a dying person. And then after the delay getting there, the news arrives that Jairus' daughter has already died. Jesus still continues, but now to go to the house of a dead child. Let's pause for a minute. I want to make this real. I want you in your mind's eye to picture someone you might know who is about 12 years old. Could be a granddaughter, could be friends, could be niece. Picture a 12-year-old young girl and imagine her lying lifeless on a bench. Jesus goes in to this house and he picks up the 12-year-old girl's small, cold, limp hand, and he wraps it in his large, strong, warm hand. And Jesus does this knowing the Jewish law that he'd be defiled for 7 days and he'd have to go through the sacrifice circus and the ritual cleansing and make a sin offering before he could go to temple again. But rather than Jesus being defiled by entering the house of mourning, by touching the hand of a 12-year-old girl who had just died, Jesus pours life into her, and her spirit comes back into her body. You see, Jesus overcomes death. Jesus overcomes defilement with his touch and his words my child, get up. You see, Jesus could not be defiled. That's what the Pharisees did not understand. His holiness could not be tainted. His holiness could not be tarnished and could not be removed. Jesus could not be made unholy. And when Jesus touches something that is unholy, he makes it holy. Not like the priests of the Old Testament who had to remove their robes before they went out amongst the common people because they did not want their robes tainted or touched by the common people so that their robes would become unholy. Jesus takes what is unholy and he makes it holy. The word touched in this passage that we have just read is actually used 4 times in the account of the woman with the bleeding problem. And again, I think we underestimate the courage and the determination and the desperation of this woman. Nidar is the Jewish word for a normal menstrual cycle. Nidar. I'm giving you a new word. Might be nice to use it as a code word when you talk about these things, girls. Say it, nidar. Nidar. Now, at the end of nidar, a woman would have to count off 7 days of being clean. So she would go through her week of nidar, then she'd have 7 days of having to be clean, and then she'd have to visit the mikvah, which was like a double bath. It was 2 pools of water, and she would have to go dipped into both pools of the mikvah. I call that double dipping. Now have a new understanding of double dipping. Then she would have to go to the temple, and she would have to offer 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons as a sacrifice. It made me wonder about the lyrics of 2 turtle doves and a partridge in a... I thought it was a Christmas song. 2 turtle doves. During this time, there's more. Wait, there's more. It's not steak knives. During this period, during Nadar, and then the 7 days of cleansing afterwards, husbands and wives were not allowed to have intimacy. In fact, husbands and wives were not even allowed to sleep in the same bed, and they were not even allowed to pour each other a drink or share any utensils. So, if my calculations are correct, once you've gone through Nadar, had your 7 days of cleansing and whatever afterwards, that means out of any given month, you can only go to temple 2 weeks out of every 4. So I've just given you a new excuse, girls, if you're looking to dip out. Just go to Nadar. We will all understand. However, this woman was not healthy. What she had going on was not Nadar. What was happening for her was something called Zavar. Everyone say Zavar. Zavar, which meant she bled constantly. So there was never a cleansing bath because you had to have 7 days free before you could go into the cleansing bath. There was never the offering of 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons so that she could return to worship at the temple. You see, this woman was actually isolated from worship. And if she was married, it doesn't say, she would be isolated from all intimacy for a period of 12 years. Not to mention she was most likely very anemic and very weak. To be touched by someone who was bleeding caused a person to be defiled, according to Jewish law. So this woman thought, I'll just touch the hem. I'll just touch the hem of his garment, because she knew that she would defile a person if she actually touched their body. I will just touch the hem. She's going to touch the part of the garment to which the tassels are attached. She reaches out and she touches the tassels. What do the tassels represent? They represent the law of God. All she knew was to somehow try and touch the law. She didn't realize that Jesus was the one who came to fulfill all the law. But he, in his mercy, as she reaches out and just touches the tassels that represented the law, that represents Jesus' holiness, maybe she thought he wouldn't notice. Instantly, after 12 years, the woman's bleeding stops. 12 years of isolation, 12 years of banishment from worship and fellowship, 12 years of no physical intimacy. Jesus immediately felt the contact of this woman's faith, touching his robe, drawing power from him. And he says, "Who touched me?" Why does Jesus ask? This is exposing this woman who's trying to just duck in and disappear. She's exposed, but it's not to shame her. You see, Jesus wants to reconnect her. Jesus wants to restore her publicly. This woman's now healed. She now can go through your rituals of cleansing. She now can be restored to worship. She now can go back and be with her husband or have intimacy with her husband. She can rejoin life and she can rejoin community. Jesus did that publicly. Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. Not only does Jesus heal her physically, I think we get really hung up on the physical healing. We go, great, the bleeding stopped. But he reinstates her relationship with him and the Father as publicly. He calls her, what is it? Daughter. Daughter, can you imagine after 12 years of isolation, exclusion from fellowship, worship, or any personal intimacy, her own family had to be excluded from her. What did it feel like for her to be called daughter, to be embraced? She'd been willing to settle for touching the hem, the symbol of the law and the holiness of Jesus. But Jesus wanted to touch her heart and her soul, and Jesus wanted to identify her as family. So much more in mind than physical healing, but complete restoration and wholeness and value and worth as a woman, because she wouldn't have been able to have any children over that 12-year period either. What a restoration. Instead of Jesus being defiled by the touch of a woman with unhealthy bleeding and Jesus being made unholy, the touch of Jesus makes the woman holy, who was once considered unholy, and everyone would have avoided her like the plague. When Jesus touches the unholy, he makes it holy. Yeah. Unlike the Old Testament priests, Jesus cannot be defiled. Nothing can come near Jesus and touch him and take away his holiness. No, the reverse is true. Whatever he comes and he touches and he blesses and he embraces and he calls his, he makes holy. He makes us acceptable and he makes us family. So what does Jesus call the 12-year-old daughter of Jairus? Do you remember? My child. We overlook these words. We just look at the get up and she was brought back to life. He doesn't just raise her physically, as her father had asked. Jesus asked this young girl, or calls this young girl, my child. And in that one phrase, he just includes her, my child, as his family. I know that the Dixon family have just embraced a couple of other little children in this last week, some little boys. They'll be calling them my child. They will embrace them into the family. And even the father, this Jewish synagogue leader, trained in the law, he knew the rules. The father of this child, if this child is Jesus' child, then the father, earthly father of this child, is also welcomed into being part of God's family. A life that was once focused solely on the law and obedience to the law is now invited to be focused on a relationship with the great high priest, a relationship with Jesus. Can I ask the worship team to come up? And I would like that second song, please. So I'm asking the question for us. Pray that you've had revelation this morning, maybe some new ways of looking at things, but what does this mean for us? And I'm asking us the question, what have we settled for? Or more pointedly, what have you settled for? Does shame keep us distant? Are we ashamed and embarrassed to bring our unholiness, our sinfulness to Jesus? Because I'll let you in on a secret. Only his touch is ever going to change that situation. And he has no problem with that. He'll take uncleanness, he'll take sin, he'll take shame, he'll take embarrassment. What was unholy becomes holy when you bring it to Jesus. Have we been hiding our unholiness? Like, it's all good. I've got the, look at the tassels. It's going on. But inside, maybe there's some shame. Maybe there's something that I've hidden, some unholiness. And I just don't want to, certainly no one at church. I don't want them to know about it. It's not until we allow the touch of Jesus on that place of unholiness. See, there's nothing you can do to change it, to remove it, to get rid of it, or to stop it. The whole temple was about offerings and cleansings, and then even then you didn't get into the Holy of Holies. Jesus' final work tore that curtain in the temple, opened up the Holy of Holies, and you take your mess and your gunk and your dirt and your sin and your shame, and you take it, your unholiness, and his touch alone will make what's unholy holy. Or how are we into religious hoop jumping? Are we just touching the symbols of the law or the things about church? Or just skirt around the edges of church and, look like I'm part of the gang and dot my religious I's and cross my religious T's, and I'm doing my devotions and, I attend this and that and I give money but if I've not really brought my unholiness to Jesus, none of that. It's all good and I love it. Love church. Love everything we do, but that's not going to make you holy. Bring your unholiness to Jesus. Or maybe it's pride in ourselves. I mean, I'm doing okay. Got a good job, got a home, nice relationship on the side. I'm doing pretty well here in Australia. Life is sweet. So I might come to church and skirt around and participate in a few things, but miss the intimacy of relationship. Have we settled for a casual relationship instead of an intimate relationship? You see, Jesus, he is the God we can touch. We can hug, we can cry and slobber over. That's the sort of relationship. We can experience family with him and we don't have to worry about our unholiness or work at making ourselves holy. There's not one thing we can do to clean up our unholiness. It's only by touching Jesus up close that our unholiness is transformed automatically into his holiness. It's Jesus alone who makes us acceptable, holy, part of his family. Did nothing to deserve it, but I get to enjoy all of it. Close, healthy families have healthy touch. There are hugs and there are kisses and there are the high fives and there are the gazes into each other's eyes and there are endearments, the darlings, the honey, the sweethearts. We say nice things to each other. Jesus called an isolated sick woman daughter as a term of endearment. And even as Jesus himself came out of the waters of baptism, God the Father spoke out of heaven, and what did he say? This is my Son, in whom I'm well pleased. And Jesus lovingly calls Jairus' daughter my child. Don't doubt it. Jesus wants a close sense of family and belonging with us. And he did not sacrifice himself on the cross just to save us from our sins. Shock. He did not die on the cross just to save us from our sins. His bigger goal was to rebuild and to restore a family that was lost. To call back children back into his arms, back into the arms of the Father, and back into a home in heaven. Jesus was seeking lost sons and daughters back into the family of God. The cross was just the pathway to it, not the end of the story. What endearment, I wonder, does Jesus have for you? And are you close enough to hear it? Daughter, son, my child. For some of us, there may be no earthly parents left to speak those endearments but Jesus does. And it struck me while I was preparing this message, and I thought, as of the beginning of this year, I have no earthly parents left. No one ever writes a card to me anymore that says, "Dear daughter." No one speaks those words to me, but Jesus does. I forever am a daughter of the King. I am forever a daughter. Maybe you have experienced disappointments and rejections, but there's a hand out to you today, and it's the hand of Jesus. And he's calling you to be part of his family. He doesn't want to just forgive your sins. I think if we get the bigger picture here, we'll be drawn to him. The sin problem is not a problem. Jesus dealt with it. Sin problem's gone. I think the problem is a relational problem where he just wants to be in relationship with us. But we got all this baggage in front of us and like, too unholy, too much mess. That's not the problem, because as soon as Jesus touches our unholiness, he makes it holy. No matter what your story, no matter what your past. Jesus is the God we can touch. So vastly different to the Old Testament priests who kept themselves away from the people so that they could stay holy. They didn't want to be made unholy. Jesus alone turns our unholiness into holiness. And that's because Jesus alone is the Holy One. I wonder what you've been looking for, what have you been trying to grab a hold of? There's a new start. I've got a prayer up on the screen now, on the last slide, and I would invite us to say this prayer together.